Hi. Welcome. How many have we got at the moment? Oh, there's 9 of us, including us 3. Okay. So I'm the chair of a charity called the Centre for Personalised Education, or CPE for short, and our remit is all alternatives to mainstream education. So we're kind of an academic type of an institution. We are a bit of a think tank. We have a lot of quite feisty discussion about school and the alternatives to school. We do a lot of critiquing of school and stuff. We've had a bad couple of years, obviously, like everybody has, and not been functioning in the normal way. But when the normal run of things, we have 2 journals a year. And we have some learning exchanges and opportunities to meet and talk about all sorts of things. We also support flexi schooling. So the flexi schooling Facebook groups belong to CPE, for example. Me personally, I'm a paralegal. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Paralegals. I used to home educate. I home educated from the year 1999 right up until about 5 years ago, when my daughter opted to go to a selective grammar school. So I've done one child all the way through to 16, and the other one up to 11. Very different experiences with both of them. Learnt a lot along the way. I'm currently fighting the schools bill, as are we all, I hope. And as chair of CPE and also as an individual, I'm a member of something called the Elective Home Education Alliance, which is a coming together of a lot of different organisations that have got things to do with home education. It's got media people in it, it's got academics in it, all sorts of things, and we try to along just a few policies, like being anti-registration and anti-monitoring and that kind of thing, and we're hoping to coordinate this campaign, or inform it. I wouldn't say necessarily coordinate it, but inform the campaign against the proposals in the schools bill. Randall Hardy here, he's also a member of the Alliance, as is Amy Miles. Amy Miles is also a volunteer for CPE as well. So that's us. Right, we'll get started, shall we? I've not done this talk before, so bear with me. And I was just saying I was up till 2 o'clock this morning changing it because schools bill. So I've added some bits in that relate to the schools bill. So if you can keep yourselves on mute for now, you can have your cameras on, off, whatever makes you comfortable. Put questions in the chat if it's relevant at the time or important at the time, then I'll take the questions as they come up, and Amy will pass them to me. But otherwise, I'm hoping we'll have a fair chunk of time at the end for some Q&As. And Randall will be really helpful with that as well, because Randall will be really helpful with that. I can't even see him nodding because he's switched his camera off.
He's turned his camera off.
Right, yes. Okay. So let me see if I can share screens. Oh, the cat's sneezing. There we go. That's really good. Right. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, that's presenting nicely.
Terrific. So this talk is called Fear of the Unusual and Practice of Policy-Based Evidence Making. And we've seen a lot of this recently. And let me see. Yes, it's working. It's working. So what do I mean by policy-based evidence making? Well, examples of it would be any of the things in this list. So propaganda, of course, would be the first thing that would come to mind. What it is it's really, it can be rumor, rhetoric, it can be the presentation of statistics in a way that supports the policy that you want to come about. So we've got it can even be fabrication, and I've got a really good example of that later on. But all of these things that are used in order to change hearts and minds, or encourage people or condition people to accept a policy that you want to introduce before you introduce it. So what we have got going on, or have had going on recently, is a lot of talk about ghost children. I'm sure a lot of you have heard Rob Halfon, the chair of the Education Committee, talking about ghost children. I don't know who the ghost children are. Amy and I had a meeting with somebody from Oxfordshire the other day who works in the local authority, and she said, I don't know what ghost children are either. So this, it's all this language and emotive stuff as well as even reports that are presented as if they are absolutely factual. Okay, so fear of the unusual. Well, that would be that. These are the three things I came up with that I thought were relevant for us. So by practicing something unusual, like home education, and when I say unusual, I mean it's not the norm. So anything that steps outside of what most people do is by its very nature unusual. So by stepping outside of the accepted norm, which in our case is sending our children to school, we are providing an innate criticism of what is normal. So by voting with our feet, we are criticising the alternative. There's always this feeling of a suspicion bred of unfamiliarity. When you hear people talk about home education, when they've seen unschooling and don't understand it, they get very suspicious about it, because they can't distinguish between feckless parenting and unschooling. So there's that natural suspicion that leads them to fear the unusual, or to criticise the unusual, or to want to fight against the unusual, and a dislike of cultural pluralism. This happens quite a lot. Certainly, it's talked of in Europe quite a lot. If you listen to any of the politics in Europe, a dislike of cultural pluralism is a real proper drive to, for example, ban home education, as in Germany. So that's the concepts I was thinking of when I came up with this challenging title for my talk. Okay, so let's go back in history and we'll look at things like truth and some examples of manipulation. So Socrates in ancient Greece, he argued that absolute truth is knowable. So there is a truth out there. There is a fact, a truth, etc. Lawyers will tell you that that's not the case. Lawyers these days, when they go into a court to argue something, they'll say it's not as easy as that. We've got our truth, they've got their truth, and we end up with something in the middle, quite often. And truth is not always truth. But going back to ancient Greek philosophy, Socrates said there was an absolute truth, and that when we use the truth to communicate with each other, that's when we communicate best. Plato, who was his pupil, and my daughter informs me Plato was his wrestling name. I haven't delved into that yet. She's the one that does classics. Plato said that one can arrive at the truth through the method of dialectics. So that's by questioning and testing. That's by having a debate. That's by probing and talking about things. But importantly, he said people without knowledge of the truth would use manipulation and base rhetoric to persuade audiences who couldn't tell the difference. So this is where we get, for example, somebody going around in the House of Lords before the reading of the bill saying, oh, all those children are, what about all these missing children? Wouldn't it be sensible to have a register? The missing children are a fallacy, really, and they're using this base rhetoric. They're using rhetoric and rumor and emotive talk to make people go, oh yes, we all need a register. We need to know where all these children are. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Pendle witch trials now, because I live in Pendle. My constituency is Pendle. Pendle Hill is less than 10 miles from me. That's a statue of Alice Nutter. It's quite a new statue, actually. It was put up in her home village of Roughly in 2012 on the 400th anniversary of the witch trials. So Lancashire was, if you know anything about history, you'll know that throughout the Tudor period, so after Henry VIII and up until Charles II, the country went through a lot of flux when it came to are we English Protestant or are we Catholic, and what's legal and what's not legal. And Lancashire was always very strongly Catholic. They held on to, there's a lot of houses with priest holes and things like that, and they held on to their Catholicism with a very, very firm hand indeed. And of course the powers that be didn't like that. The actual trial, there's recent evidence that's come up to say that the entire trial was actually a sham, and it was a rerun of a trial that had down south previously, and it was all to do with two warring families. It's also a massive distraction, because the early 17th century was a period which had many years of high inflation, population increase, purchasing power of the average weekly wage was the lowest for 3 centuries. There were terrorists threatening. The gap between rich and poor was widening. The Anglican Church was under pressure from inside and outside. Tensions in Europe were high. Corruption. Does it sound familiar? And history repeats itself, doesn't it? So this was a distraction from the things at the time, and there was a lot of propaganda, and you can find posters and things talking about, for example, the executions were advertised as being great opportunities to take your children to and entertain them. So different times, eh? Okay, so if we go to World War One, this is another really, really interesting one. So I don't know if anybody remembers white feathers, reading about white feathers or learning about white feathers in World War One, and that went on up to about 1915, I think. But the representation of the war in the press was really, really carefully designed to appeal to women. So they would talk in the press, and the government would be feeding the press, obviously, would talk about the rape of Belgium rather than the Germans invaded Belgium. It was the rape of Belgium. And the other news stories, they didn't know whether this was true or not. The information wasn't through, but they, even without the facts of the case, they were talking about this militarized masculinity of the German army, and that they were rampaging across Europe. And so that was and that poster there is a lovely piece of propaganda. They didn't have the word propaganda at the time, by the way. They didn't use that word. But that's a lovely piece of propaganda where it says, go defend our honor. And look, there's a little child down there, and they're quivering women. It's absolutely fascinating. And it was a massive campaign. All these women were giving white feathers to men who were not in uniform, and saying, you're a coward if you don't go fight for your country. So that's a massive manipulation of the population there to send all the men to their deaths. This is a recent one, Poland and abortion. You must have read about it and seen it. I have a number of friends in Poland, some of them women who were marching in the streets in Warsaw when this happened, and it was the summer of the first lockdown. That was the summer of 2020, I believe, when most of the marching was going on, and it was horrific. There was riot police and everything on the streets. Poland's got a fascinating history because it's very tied with the Catholic Church, and so Catholic values are considered to be the values of the country. Even though they've had legalized abortion in Poland for longer than most countries in the world. And this is where we get the idea of something called zombie ideas, which is a concept which is talked about a lot in sociology papers and things. This is zombie ideas are ideas which have been discredited by either scientific evidence or social practice, but they're resuscitated and brought back into public life, and they're repeated and repeated again until people stop being outraged. So it's a kind of brainwashing, if you will, that the state can do using propaganda. They're called zombie ideas, one because they sort of start eating your brains out, and the other definition is that they're ideas that refuse to die. So the ideas that were brought back in with this was that abortion was murder. So abortion is murder, and that was, just propagated and propagated and propagated, and it's a horrific amount of sexism going on in politics in Poland right now. Now, this one's the one that my colleague and friend Sean uses quite a lot to relate to us. Weapons of mass destruction. What a scandal that was. This belief that was. It wasn't even a belief. I don't even know whether Tony Blair believed it or not, but he asserted that these weapons programs, which had actually already been shut down by the UN, and the weapons inspectors had been in, and all the chemical weapons had been destroyed, and Saddam Hussein never actually made a nuclear missile. And none of his stuff could get more than 400 miles from the country either. So it's really fascinating how this was wound up. And I don't know if any of you recognise that man there. That's Colin Powell. He was Bush's. He was in Bush's administration in America. And this is him holding a fake vial of anthrax. And you can see how he's holding it. He's holding it very gingerly like that. And he's sitting in the UN Security Council. And what he's saying is Saddam Hussein and his regime will stop at nothing until something stops him. So he was arguing that Iraq was deceiving the UN weapons inspectors. And he gave a really forceful presentation, and it just cinched the US case for preemptive war against Iraq in front of the international community. So the phrase that was really interesting was, he said, what we are giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. But it was actually a complete lie. And the underlying intelligence was created. This is how governments can use, the state can use their manipulation of the facts and their misrepresentation of the facts to have massive effect. This is possibly one of the worst ever lies ever told to the world, and a lot of people died. So I thought we'd go over a bit of a timeline of the attack on home education, the most recent attack on home education. When I started home educating in 1999, things were quite settled, really. We had quite a nice regime. Mostly people behaved themselves. Local authorities weren't horrific. You didn't get checked up on every year. In fact, my son was never known to the local authority in the entirety of his school age period. My daughter was, but that was because things had changed by the time she was born in 2005. So at that point, 1999, 2/3 of, and this is only 10 years before the Badman thing, 2/3 of home educators were unknown to local authorities. As times have changed, and as the education offer in schools has become much more rigid and much more narrow, and less we've got more special needs and less provision for those special needs. And as that has happened, there have been more and more deregistrations. So now the vast majority of home educators are actually deregistrations from school. Unlike when I started, where the majority of home educators had never sent their children to school at all. It was just a continuation of attachment parenting, if you will. So the landscape started, I mean, changes happened all the time, and Randall would pick me up on this if he had his mic on. But this is a sea change at this point. In the day after my birthday, January the 19th, 2009, I was sitting in a meeting with Fiona Nicholson, who some of you will know who she is, at North Yorkshire County Council, talking about home education, and the review was launched on that day. Very memorable day. Now, Graham Badman met with me twice. I introduced him to lots of groups I was determined that he would be in possession of the facts. And he met with something like 1,500 home educated children, families, people involved in home education. And he ignored every word they said to him and wrote what he wanted anyway. And his review was published in June 2009. And the following month, the Education Select Committee in the House of Commons began their inquiry into the review and report, and they absolutely damned it. And we also we have one of our own in the Alliance again, Chloe Newby, who at the age of 15 in 2009 confronted Mr. Badman about his very poor statistics and pointed out the error of his ways. She's since gone on to become a statistician. So thanks, Mr. Badman. You've managed to give us one of the best statisticians, and she helped us debunk a report a couple of years ago, which I'll talk to you about in a bit. So Graham Stewart MP was our absolute hero in the House of Commons. We had Lord Lucas in the House of Lords, and we had Graham Stewart in the House of Commons. And in December 2009, he led a mass petition in the House of Commons, a mass presentation of a parliamentary petition. That's a paper petition that comes from every constituency, and the MPs, or they give it to one of their mate MPs. My MP can't present it himself because he's in government, he's the HS2 minister. So he's going to give, so when we do this again, he's going to give the petition I give him, he's going to give to somebody else to present. But it's quite a spectacle. The whips hate it, which is always good. You know, upset the whips, you've got a bit of anarchy in the House of Commons, and you've got your golden. So he had this mass petition. He got petitions from 120 constituencies were presented, which is not bad. We're going to do this again, and we're going to beat the record. That was a record beater. We're going to do this again, and we're going to beat that record. Okay, so in May 2010, there was a general election. Graham Stewart, who up until that time had just been a member of the Education Committee, Okay, so Badman's recommendations went into the Children's Schools and Families Bill, and we got rid of them through a stroke of luck because of this technical process that happens when there's a general election, or that's not scheduled a long way in advance. It's called the wash up, and they just trade bits of legislation and strike off other bits. And then Graham Stewart became chair of the Education Committee himself. May 2012, they launched an inquiry. I've been talking to Graham for ages, and he was persuaded to do an inquiry into home education, just to sort of set the record straight. He was trying to make sure that, you know, the facts, that rather than the disinformation that had been propagated by Graham Badman, were put into the. So one thing to say about all of this, it was a good inquiry. I was an oral witness at it. I was there to talk about local authorities not following the law, and also to talk about safeguarding. And the report was really nice, had a load of recommendations in it, only one of which was implemented, which was the 14 to 16 college places, which we still have some of, but it's fading. During this time, we had 2 consecutive children's commissioners. Maggie Two Words Atkinson. We always called her Maggie Two Words Atkinson because she went into the committee when she was appointed. She went into the committee and she was banging on about home education, and she smacked her hand down on the desk and she said she was talking about safeguarding and no oversight of home educating families and blah blah blah, and she said, "I'll give you 2 words, Kyra Ishak." So that's why she's called Maggie Two Words Atkinson. Kyra Ishak was never properly home educated. People knew there were problems, and she unfortunately died of starvation and cruelty. And the court case, the summary of the court case, actually, the judge actually says home education had nothing to do with this. This was social services not doing their job. But the serious case review says home education was to blame. Right. So then we had Anne Longfield, who is still hanging around banging on about home education. In February 2019, by the way, she did a documentary, a Dispatches documentary, where she actually made the 15-year-old in the home educating family cry on camera. She was horrible. She was so horrible that the production company had to pay for counselling for the family. That's how bad she was. She was awful, and she's still awful and talking nonsense about home education. She talks about off-the-grid children, the local government association, which is like a club that all the local authorities, even the parish councils, can join. The chair of their Children and Young People's Board at the time, Antoinette Bramble, said, placing a legal duty on parents to register homeschooled children with their local authority will also help councils to monitor how children are being educated and prevent them from disappearing from the oversight of services designed to keep them safe. Now, I want you to think about that phrase, the oversight of services designed to keep them safe. Services designed to keep them safe. The services are not designed to keep children safe. They are not the police of children. What they are there to step in if there is a problem. And this is where we get this falsehood coming in. We get this manipulation of the law and of the facts. So that rhetoric saying that there are people out there who are supposed to oversee children. It's the state inserting themselves in between parents and children, and it's them taking on a burden that they don't have. They're taking on a duty that they actually don't have. So back to this. June 2017, Lord Sauer introduced his private members bill. It was abandoned eventually in July 2018, although it's never actually officially been abandoned, by the way. It's still visible on the bill's part of the parliamentary website. And Lord Sauer saw the rights of children and parents as conflicting, and this is another falsehood that is perpetuated, that the rights of children and parents conflict. They don't conflict. They are aligned very much, and it is a parent's duty to promote the welfare of a child and to keep them safe. So, April 2019, the Children Not in School consultation was launched. We only got the results of it in May 2022. They were well over timetable on producing the results of that. And they can't really blame COVID because it should have been launched before COVID was even thought about. February 2020, so the Children Not in School consultation was where was the proposal for a register, basically. February 2020, regulating independent in educational institutions consultation was launched. That covers things like self-directed education establishments, self-managed learning college down in Brighton, all of these kind of unusual part-time institutions or settings, as we like to call them, or learning communities. That was an attempt to regulate them, and we've got the results of that through in the schools bill as well. September 2020, the Education Committee under the chair, Rob Halfon, launched an inquiry into home education. Rob's had a bee in his bonnet about home education for ages. He thinks that people are radicalising. He's told me that to my face while I've been sat in his office, that it's being used to radicalise children. So he launched his inquiry, and when he launched his inquiry, he basically went onto Radio 4 and told us what the result of the inquiry would be before he'd even received a single piece of evidence. And that's the bit that got us mad, and that's what stimulated Joe Merritt down at Exeter University and me to have the idea to come up with the alliance and say, we've got to fight this on all fronts as a unified thing. In November 2020, the Local Government Association published their report entitled Children Missing Education. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And in March 2021, there was a report published recommending, March 2021, the Education Committee report was published recommending a register. Fast forward to the present. February was when the Children Not in School consultation was published. May was when the Regulating Independent Educational Institutions report was published. And the schools bill received its first reading in the House of Lords. So here we've got a fantastic piece of policy-based evidence making. This is the delightful report that I referred to before, the LGA report on children missing education. It's not a report on children missing education. On something like the first page, it talks about children missing a formal academic education. So what the LGA have done is they've taken all the children who are unschooled and essentially said that they are not educated. Okay, this is a piece of rhetoric they put in here that this is the astounding piece that I just cannot get my head around. Not all children who are home educated are missing education. For the purposes of this analysis, we have assumed that 75% of the additional children that's new to home education from a baseline of 2014 to 15 are those who will be missing out on a formal full-time education. Okay, so in their figures, and they came up with an astounding figure, in their figures, in their report, they have put 75% of new home educators after 2015 are not providing this education. I couldn't resist showing you this. This is the quality of this report. This is the report that Chloe, you remember, the statistician, we produced a report on this report as a result of her analysis and mine. The numbers don't even add up. If you add up the numbers around the outside of that circle, they don't add up to 244,000. This is how badly written this report. They get a D- from me, these lot. Well, they don't probably get an E. Didn't try hard enough. In the report as well, so there's a figure here of 6,000 at the bottom left. You can see that it says estimates taken from Ofsted investigations, illegal schools, 6,000 children. So Ofsted estimated that there were 6,000 pupils being educated in the 259 unregistered settings they inspected between January 2016 and 2019. And in the report, there's a heading, illegal schools. There is no national data on the number of illegal schools, institutions operating as schools but not registered as independent schools. Ofsted estimated there were 6,000 pupils being educated in the 259 unregistered settings. Now, just because you're unregistered does not make you an illegal school. Of those 259, something like 5 were prosecuted. The rest were found to be complying with the law. So this is a fantastic piece of misinformation. They are telling everybody that there are 6,000 children in illegal schools when they are not actually in illegal schools. These are not illegal schools. They are legal settings. They are part-time. They operate for less than 18 hours a week. And they totally don't need to register as independent institutions. And the children do not get all of their education from these settings. They get some of it from these settings. Another nice piece of fiction, the Association of Directors of Children's Services report. This one is the one where they base it on a survey. It's a really, really biased survey. It's a very, very leading survey. I've got a couple of questions that I'll show you from it. And basically, just very quickly, this one says that there were 66,648 children known to local authorities on the 1st of October 2020. And then they estimate from that's from 133 LAs. And then they use the worst kind of model to estimate from the ones they don't get the surveys back from, because there were 151 LAs, so they had to make up nearly 20 answers somehow, and their guesstimate gets them to 75,668. We know that the actual figure was 69,791, which is significantly less, which is about 8% less. The importance of this is that they are using, not that the number is particularly important, but that they are manipulating figures, and Education Otherwise had absolutely accurate figures, and nobody is taking any notice of those figures. So this is an example of a question from the survey that they send out. Where a home educated child is identified as not receiving a suitable education, does your authority record this as a child missing education? A very leading question. You wouldn't pass your bachelor's degree based on the kind of survey these guys send out, and you certainly wouldn't pass it based on how they analyse the results. And then this question, number 17 down here, what percentage of your total elective home educating cohort are known to children's social care? Known to children's social care. You can be known to children's social care because you have autism, not because you're in danger or at risk. You've just got autism. You could be known to children's social care because you had a death in the family about 10 years ago. There's all sorts of reasons you'd be known to children's social care. So let me just check my notes, see if I missed anything. Yeah, there are other questions like that. There was a question on the survey that is, are you aware of children who are electively home educated in your area attending unregistered or illegal schools? If yes, please tell us how many. So where we are now is policy creep has been allowed, partly through the use of this misinformation and this drip thing, and these zombie ideas. And the schools bill is, we believe it's totalitarian in its approach. But of course, the register is seen as sensible. It's common sense, because all of the children, all children don't have the oversight from professionals. So we're back to this oversight from professionals thing. And children's rights and those of parents are seen as conflicting, and parents can't be trusted with their children once they reach 5 years old, because this register is only about over 5-year-olds. It doesn't care about the ones who are most at risk, which are the under 5s or indeed the under 1s. So in conclusion, I would say the bill's not child-based, but it's policy-based. There's no interests of any child appears in this bill at all. It's just all about saying the right words and ticking the right boxes and putting them on yet another list, which never saves them. all the children who've died who were tagged as home educated, all of them, home education was not a contributing factor, and they were already on multiple lists. They were on lots of lists already, look, and that didn't help. So good legislation exists because of evidence need, not because it looks like a good idea. And we've got to hold that in our heads when we have our arguments. And we need not to put legislation in place that allows bad people in the future to do bad things. So the Nazis got into power through perfectly legal means. They never broke the law in the 12 years. And the 12 years after they got into power, we had Auschwitz. You let bad people in because you've got bad law. You pay the consequences. I'm not saying we're going to have a Holocaust, but what I'm saying is, it's very easy to use the law to get bad stuff to happen. And if we let through a bill that has as many leaky bits in it as the one that we've got, and is because it's based on the rhetoric, and it opens the door to so many things, we are allowing people in the future to use that bill to do bad things, because it's not nice and tightly written. I had a telephone conversation with my MP late at night last night, as I do, and I said, don't laugh. I said, but good legislation is elegantly and concisely written. Well, I thought he was going to have a fit. He was laughing so hard. So we ignore the lessons of history at our peril, and we need to choose not to live by lies. So I think that's me done. There we go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if anybody's got anything they would like to say.
Thank you, Alison. That was really informative. Hopefully we've got a few questions coming up here now. If you'd like to ask a question of Alison, either pop it in the chat if you're a bit camera shy, or just raise your hand. There is a function on Zoom that you can raise an animated hand instead. Julie, thank you so much for volunteering to be first. I'll get you up here.
Oh,
Hello.
Hello. We've spoken online once or twice, but never actually.
We have. I was just thinking exactly the same thing.
Yes.
I recognise that name.
Yeah, it's a very memorable name. Juliet would be able to tell you that I'm a old hand, and actually it was the Badman situation that actually got me into home education in the first place, because I was pregnant at the time, never heard of home education. It was all the publicity that is the reason why I'm home educating today. So
right, good.
Yeah. So yeah, all good stuff. I agree with you completely. But how do we get councillors and MPs to take this on board? Because when you actually speak to councillors, and this actually goes for councillors in the Green Party as well, who are actually the most friendly party to home education at the moment. It includes Green Party councillors. They have bought the rhetoric completely. Okay. Yeah. My MP, when I wrote to her about the schools bill, told me to go away and not to bother her. And then she said that our local authority, which is actually quite friendly towards home educators, generally speaking, does take their responsibilities to enforce the monitoring of home education very seriously, and then sent me some minutes to a scrutiny board, during which they accepted every single thing on the reports you've just highlighted as absolutely factual, and said they called for a mandatory register of children not in school. Now, bearing in mind that they're a local authority that is actually on good terms with the local home educators, they've been asked at this meeting for home educators to be invited. They were not, and they went ahead and they had this meeting. And then they drew all these conclusions based on these reports. So how do we get them to start understanding its rhetoric and its lies, that it's on manufactured statistics? They won't listen to anything we say, and it's incredibly frustrating.
There are two things. One of them is to get a hold of. So, for example, we did a report on the LGA report, which should be freely available. In fact, it was put in. It was put in. Randall, are you there? No. Okay. It was.
Yes,
Hi.
I'm here. I was just muted.
Yeah, we put the report in as a submission to the education committee, didn't we?
Yeah.
So if you look, I'm trying to think whose name it would be under. It's probably under the Centre for Personalised Education. So if you look on the responses to the House of Commons Education Committee consultation, inquiry into home education, you will find the second submission by the Centre for Personalised Education was that report on the LGA report. So that debunks all the figures. Also, I mean, anything that you can find that's research based that debunks the figures is really great. There is a House of Commons briefing paper on home education, which is held in the House of Commons Library, available online. And that has in it a criticism of the ADCS's numbers and says they are unreliable, and EO's numbers are reliable because they come from 100% FOI returns. Also, you have to make it personal. So my favorite campaigner, American chap called Dustin Lance Black, who campaigned for LGBTQ plus rights in America and for gay marriage very successfully. He says that in order to change legislation and thought and all the rest of it, you have to change hearts, change minds. And in order to change minds, you have to change hearts. And in order to change hearts, you have to tell stories, personal stories. You have to put what's in the bill through the filter of what it would do to your family. So if the bill comes into place, it's going to do this to my family. Or, you know, my son, let me use my family as an example. My son learned to read when he was nearly 9. If some of the aspects of the bill came in, they would be sending him to school. School would not have been the right place to him. He would have had mental health problems and may even have been dead from suicide by now. You know, it's that kind of thing that they need to hear. They need to hear how it affects your family. Randall.
Yeah, can I just come in, because the way of doing that and real life experience, I think it was in 2016, 17, it was certainly BC before COVID. We picked up that local home educators here in Shropshire were really being hassled by the team. And again, being off the top of home education, we had a bit more, but they were hitting a blank wall with the staff. They were not getting anywhere with the staff. Now, this was not a short process, but we knew our local councillor already. She came round, we had a cup of tea with her over our kitchen table. We talked to her. She set up a meeting with the portfolio holder in the council for children and also for the chair of the scrutiny committee. They brought in the head of department and our director of children's services, I think, to that meeting without telling us. That didn't take us anywhere immediately. Several months later, we had another conversation with our local councillor. They'd had a change of the top 2 positions in the council. We then met with them. They agreed, a consultation was put out on a new policy, which was terrible. And they really, their department really messed it up. They didn't tell the people they knew were home educating about it till a week before the deadline. And we pressed them and they extended it. When, with the consultation, I marked it like an exam paper. and sent it back. But I talked about the person who'd written it in the third person. And I said, this person doesn't understand law. They wouldn't even get a grade C if it was a GCSE on home educating law. And everything went quiet. Sometime later, I'm looking on their website and there's a brand new policy there. And it's 90% good. There's only small bits in it. It was a great improvement on the old one. But that came through engaging with counsellors. So if you've got trouble with your counsellor, with your counsel, and you're not getting a good conversation after one or two goes with the staff, go to your local counsellor, press to meet their heads of their departments with them, because in the end, local counsellors on the whole know nothing about home education, and they're not that bothered because it's only a tiny part of their budget. And why these negative campaigns work is because most counsellors, when it comes to education and children's services, are so embedded in you don't want to be caught with your team's trousers down, dropping kids. And so what they are really bothered about is the safeguarding. And so if you meet with the counsellors, one, you're educating them, and two, you're saying to them, but this is messing up people's lives.
But you're also putting a human face on it, because one of the reasons they don't invite the home educators into that meeting that you said about is because then they would be having to deal with human beings rather than bits of paper. And as soon as they have to start dealing with human beings for whom they are going to cause distress and trouble and all the rest of it, then it becomes much more complicated in their heads, and they have to start looking at things in a different way. Certainly, I mean, you can manage to make some of them not sleep at night if you tell good enough stories. That would be one of the things. You know, that sounds really horrible, but you know that's where it has to go. You know, children are going to die if this bill goes through as it is. Children are going to die, and so are parents fleeing domestic violence. They are going to die. It's so badly written. And the DFE haven't even got a clue what the legislation says in it. We had a meeting with the DFE yesterday morning. And do you know what, Amy, it feels like about 30 years since yesterday morning. We had a meeting with the DFE. We had a meeting with the DFE yesterday morning with a top, like a top ranking senior civil servant. And I was telling my MP this last night. He was flabbergasted. And I pointed out one thing that it said in the bill, where it basically says if you've got an education and healthcare plan and you get a school attendance order, you can never ask for that school attendance order to be revoked, even if you are providing a suitable education at home. And I said, how can this be right? He went, it doesn't say that in the bill, does it? And I went, yes, it does. So they don't even, so they've got this idea, oh, we want to do this, and this, and then they send it off to their analysts who ignore all the appropriate research and just look at the stuff that fits their agenda, the rhetoric and the rumours and the nonsense that Spielman is spouting, and they write the most ridiculous, awfully written piece of legislation that's got holes in it in some places and conflicts in other places and doesn't follow the law in the existing legislation, and just creates an unholy bureaucratic mess. No. Okay.
Is there any other questions? I'd like to go back to the beginning of your presentation before we finish, Alison. But
I knew you would. I knew you would.
Other people time.
I haven't had any other questions from anyone else in the room live. Alison, have you got anything else you'd like to add?
I want to hear what Randall's got to say.
Okay, go for it, Randall.
I think that quote from Plato, was it The Wrestler?
Yeah, Plato.
Right. I love that line. is essential, because this thing of learning to recognize truth. Because if you learn to recognize truth, you can spot the fakes. I've been told, I don't know if it's true, that if they're training bank tellers to spot fake notes, they actually get them to understand what a real note looks like. And the problem is, I think you said it, Alison, that the majority of the population do not know how to spot the truth.
Yeah.
Therefore, they swallow fakes. But it's a process we're all learning on. And
Yeah.
one thing I would like to suggest is, if in a debate or an argument, people use emotive terminology when they have no need to, then you can think that you have to say, is this being used as a propaganda tool? And I'm afraid, Alison, I think you fell for one.
What one?
The zombie facts.
Oh, it's seriously, it's in 100 academic papers. It's really fascinating.
But it is actually a piece of reverse propaganda. So they call it zombie facts because people remember phrases like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a skill, in marketing a pushback campaign, you have to come up with similar phrases.
Yeah.
But they do not have to be emotive in the same way. So Alison's title for this talk is Policy-Based Evidence Making. Now, that is a brilliant example of a phrase that catches people's attention, but it doesn't over-egg the emotions. And so I would say to people, in any part of life, I fear it's happening with the present situation in Ukraine. The word that's attached to Putin's name more often than not is evil. People don't know whether he is or not. They're just taking it on board. Radicalization with home education has been brought together by Michael Wilshaw, who was head of Ofsted, and other prominent people. Why? Because they know they cannot win the, and I'm going to give a plug here, civil liberties argument, because that's my session later, unless they get people to be emotive and say, this is terrible, we need to stop this happening. So that is the area I just flag up and say, watch the language. If the language being used is emotive, be careful.
Yeah, and the other thing is, if they are boiling complex things down to simplistic terms, they're hiding something. They're always hiding something. So if they're making something black and white that you know damn well is not black and white, then they're hiding something. Heidi, you had your hand up.
I do now, and I realise the time, we're at the hour, but I've been trying to work out if I ask this question and how intelligent it will sound or whatever, because I'm very distant to this, of course. We've started to relook at legislation here, but we are registered, but it's very easygoing. We put reports in, like it's nothing like as controlling as what I'm hearing here. I'm speaking on Tuesday night about dealing with the yuck feelings about that come up, doubt, anxiety, all of that can I actually home educate? Can I do all of this? Now in the UK, you've got all of these things happening that are causing yuck feelings. And you're saying here, we need to focus on the truth. We need to share our story. I want to know is practically, how do we share, encourage and enable and, ask people to be bolder and louder and focus on their freedom whilst they're home educated. They've got their kids, they want to home educate. Like all this could be totally time consuming. And then you actually give to the government what they're looking for, and that's inept home education. because we're totally distracted with this. So how do we balance this, write our stories? So I'm saying our as if I'm there in the UK with you, because I want to support you all. So how do we write our stories and keep that balance and teach our children to identify the true banknote? How do we teach our children to look for the truth for the next generation, and by default be the change in doing that?
Well, depending on the age of the child, you involve them in the process. That's what happens. So they become educated because it is part of the process. My daughter Emerald was 4 years old when the Badman report came out, or nearly 4 years old. I just took her with me everywhere. She met Graham Badman twice. She couldn't remember his name. She used to call him Mr. Naughty. Which I thought was brilliant. But yeah, so I just used to take her with me. I mean, I've always done that with my children. I've always been a campaigner. You know, ever since I was a child, I've been a campaigner, and I've just always seen it as part of my life. So you know, during the Badman era, we were down in London quite a lot. So I used to go and visit other home educators. We'd go down to London, we'd have a great time, she'd meet new people, etc., etc. I do the stuff at the top level, so that wouldn't be everybody's experience. But you can go and have a picnic in the park that's part of your campaign. You can go and do interesting things. You can do a demonstration that's part of your campaign. You can go around collecting petition signatures that's part of your campaign that you can involve your children in. So for me, it's about involving the family and involving the children, because if we don't step up to the mark, then we're going to lose it. We're going to absolutely lose it. If people don't step up and start campaigning and start educating, then we are going to lose the ability to do what we do. And quite frankly, home education shouldn't be taking you 9 to 5 every day, because the kids need a vast amount of freedom in order to develop their thought processes and all the rest of it. Randall,
the fear can take 24 hours a day, and
100%. Yeah,
focus on the truth, and that's love, and that's heart, and that's writing those stories. When you're in this campaigning, and when we're wanting to support our self-directed kids, they may want nothing to do with that, and they say, Mum, that drains me, I don't like that, I want to write poetry, I want to know, and what is that's when you get your kid to write poetry, and you send the poetry to the MP and say, look, this is home education, the piece of education.
Randall,
just two things very quickly on this time factor. You may have noticed by the colour of my hair, etc., our children aren't at home anymore. One of my saddest things about the home educating community is when children stop being home educated, far too many parents stop defending home education. And if nothing else, if you've got any influence amongst home educators, do tell them that once their children leave, whatever home educating community they were part of still needs them. They need them to be wiser people within there who've been that way, but they also need them on the front line of defending it. And even if this bill is overcome, we mustn't make the same mistake as a lot of people made after Badman. That's over and done with, because it was always going to come back. So that's point. The second point, Heidi, you asked about how do we teach them. I listened to an interview I hadn't heard before with a guy called Rod Dreyer yesterday, and that line, live not by lies, is actually a Solzhenitsyn one that he's put into the title of a book. And he used an illustration on that's in the book, he talked to people who grew up in Eastern Europe when the rise of communism was coming. And he asked one of them about how they were prepared for what was coming, because their parents couldn't tell them the details about communism. And this mother had read with them Lord of the Rings 3 or 4 times. And basically Lord Dreher's line was, the children couldn't understand what communism was, but they knew what Mordaf, is it? Or
Mordor.
Mordor looked like. And so they could recognize that in the political system when it was growing. So sometimes we have to find a way of showing them the light and also saying, but darkness will come and try and take this. And I think we've got to face up. There's a real chance. You know, I'm fighting hard to make sure it doesn't happen now, but there is a move, because independent, free-thinking people are not what the government or the state wants.
That's right. So, Randall, we're going to have to wrap it up.